pleasure to finally meet you again and see you again. And you've been studying cannabis, probably like the history of cannabis. You're kind of a pioneer in that area, eh?
I wrote my doctoral dissertation in 1970 on the history of marijuana mythology, and was lucky to have it accepted as a PhD dissertation in the State University of New York at Buffalo.
Wow.
And it's a very interesting story, actually, about my dissertation. I handed in a 600-page manuscript called Free Marijuana! And the chairman of the English department didn't know what to do. He'd never had such a thing offered as a PhD, but it was a big, thick, well-researched thing. And finally he called me in about a week later, and he said, sort of scratching his head, because he wanted me to be accepted.
Right.
He wanted the dissertation to be accepted, partly because I'd run Legalized Marijuana Organization for 4 years, and I think they were interested in kind of getting me off campus, right? And not waiting another whole year to write a different dissertation. So he said, you know what, we have never had a folklore department at the English department here in Buffalo, and now we have our first folklore dissertation. So I called it Marijuana Myths and Folklore. We took out we extracted some of it, and that was accepted. I think it's the first cannabis PhD in the United States.
Wow, wow. And you were an early traveler to India in the 1960s as well, and had some experiences there with cannabis.
India was an illumination for me. I knew very little about the history of marijuana in 1964, 5, and 6 when I went to India. I went on a government-sponsored Fulbright, and I taught English to 2 different college classes. And where it really ended up was that I learned about a culture that was based on bhang rather than on alcohol. And to me, once I glimpsed that, it was so obvious that across the whole subcontinent, but particularly in the north, was based on worshiping Shiva and knowing that Shiva was the Lord of Bhang. And as opposed to the West, where the early origin myths are not at all about marijuana, but are about wine, with the story of Dionysus and bringing wine to Greece. So immediately, back in ancient history, we have this contrast between Greece and India, with one bhang being honored, being worshipped, being glorified, and in the other one, which is the story of the Bacchae by Euripides, the minute that the supposedly foreign god of wine comes into Greece, they put him in jail. So the original story of the origin of drugs in India is about the origin of marijuana and how it influenced Indian society, but the origin of drugs story of the West is about prohibition. It's about clap the guy in jail, and out of the jail in Euripides' Bacchae comes the voice of Dionysus, the voice of God, and he says, burn, burn the house of Pentheus to the ground, Pentheus being the guy who'd thrown him in jail. And that immediately suggested to me that the origin myth of India is in praise of a drug. The origin myth of Greece is against the drug that's being introduced and the story of its eventual adaptation as the primary drug of the West, alcohol.
Wow.
Very interesting clash of cultures there.
Well, you know, knowing that you've been to India, you'll probably find some of these paintings here. Tell me if you recognize any of the scenarios here.
Well, this one is beautiful. This one is Parvati serving bhang to Shiva, and guess who's drinking the bhang? Is the snake around Shiva's neck. Now that goes back to the Vedic myths of when the churning of the milk ocean, which is the primary drug myth of India, took place, many things came out of there, many gods, and so forth. And one of the things that came out early was a very venomous poison, and it threatened to destroy the whole churning of the milk ocean. And luckily, Shiva was there. Shiva drank the poison. So Shiva is known as the poison drinking god. And that saved the whole rest of the cosmos from being poisoned by whatever came out of the churning. The next thing that came out was the goddess of wine. It's very rarely remembered that wine and bhang came out in the Indian mythology at the same time. And wine has a very different history. But to bring back to this, ever since then, Shiva has, his iconography has been the snakes wrapped around his head and usually around his top knot as well. And what struck me about this is that the snake, the giver of venom, is here being tamed by drinking bhang. That's very Shivite mythology.
Yeah. Well, these are both Shiva's sons. This is Skanda, the jet of sperm,
yes, yes.
that sprouts from Shiva's lingam, and then this is his other son, the serpent. Some people say it's like a symbol of the Kundalini, which is yes. associated with cannabis and tantric practice. And cannabis has been called food of Kundalini. And you've written about the role of cannabis in tantrism as well, haven't you?
Yes. The interesting thing was that all of the forbidden things in conventional Hinduism are taken up by the tantric worshippers as an article of faith, and are used in tantric ceremonies, even including wine, but bhang as well, and intercourse is an essential part of most tantric writings. And so you bring those all together, and what you have is a situation in which drugs are accepted, even the bad drugs like wine in India. Alcohol is, the Indian attitude towards alcohol is very well summed up by the little form that Westerners get when they go into a hotel bar in India and want to drink. They are given a form that says, the first question is, how many years have you been a drunkard? I mean, that's the attitude in India, as opposed to you can walk down the street anywhere in India, and usually perched up on an elevated platform is like a 14-year-old boy, or girl sometimes, who dispenses the bhang that his father is making in the back room, and you just walk up like a fireworks stand or something, and you just walk up and buy your bhang, and they give it to you in little paper wrap things, and then you can do whatever you want to with it. Drink it right there on the spot or take it with you. This is Lord Shiva preparing bhang. The way he's doing it is with a mortar and pestle, grinding or macerating the cannabis leaves, presumably after the seeds have been taken out. You grind them up and add milk sometimes and water sometimes and cardamom sometimes. There are various hundreds of recipes for how to make bhang, of which this is symbolic of all of them. Notice the snakes are wrapped around everybody, around his foot, around his head, around his neck, and around his arms, and even around the bowl of bhang that's being prepared. The idea of that, of course, is that the snake's venom is poisonous, and the snake is able to lose the poisonous of his venom by being involved with bhang. In other words, Shiva drank the poison venom of the snake during the churning of the milk ocean, and that preserved the cosmos so that he could then calm everyone down with bhang. In Indian festivals, such as Shivratri, which is Shiva's birthday, bhang is universally used across India. You find old conventional business people who are drinking bhang.
Bhang is in great demand on the occasion of Shivratri. On this day, both licensed and unlicensed shops sell huge amounts of bhang to the faithful. The cheap intoxicant, which is in wide use in eastern India, there being over 73 licensed shops in the city, is prepared by grinding the leaves and buds of the female cannabis plant.
There are some 73 shops here. I can't say anything specific about the consumption of bhang, but yes, on Shivratri it's much higher than on other days.
The leaves and the buds are first rinsed in warm water and then either ground into a paste and sold as bhang golis or mixed with thandai, an iced beverage prepared with almonds, spices, milk and sugar. While bhang is also ground in machines, its users believe that when prepared manually, it is tastier and more effective.
The demand of bhang is very high on Shivratri because of its association with Lord Shiva. On Shivratri, the faithful treat it as prasad from the Lord, who is believed to be very fond of it.
Bhang is distributed as prasad, which is religious offering during Shiva festivals like Mahashivratri, and its consumption also goes up during Holi. Traditionally, bhang, though intoxicating, is not considered as a drug in the eastern region but as a sleeping aid and appetizer.
Thandai is prepared using dry fruits, milk and cream. We prepare it both with and without bhang. Its demand during Shivratri is high because of its connection with Lord Shiva.
And the same is true because of this story. Because look at this happy family. Look at this beautiful family. It's so peaceful. And this is a modern representation, but these iconographies go back centuries. And what you have here is a very peaceful scene with people sharing bhang with their family. Here's Ganesha down here mixing the bhang. Ganesha, of course, being Shiva's son whose head was chopped off by accident almost. He's said to have interrupted Shiva and Parvati during intercourse. And she was so pissed off that without thinking, he cut off his head. So what are we going to do? Parvati is very upset. And Shiva said, well, I'm a god. I can take the head of any creature that walks by and put him on Ganesha. And guess what walked by but an elephant? Yeah. So that's the story of that. And then he became associated literally with the making of the bhang because he's the god of good fortune in India, among several other goddesses who imply good fortune. And this is the same thing. This one over here is Parvati pouring bhang into Shiva's bowl, and right there is the snake come to get it. So what it really means is that the snake is making sure that the poison of the bhang is not in the bhang before Shiva drinks it. It's like a poison taste tester. Right. Very interesting.
Your journey in India, these are like antique chillums, and a picture of a fakir in Delhi there smoking a chillum, and here's a Hindu sadhu smoking a chillum as well.
Indeed. The chillum, of course, is one of the oldest forms of a pipe in the whole world. Out of it developed many other different varieties, including the hookah, which is, well, let me tell that little story. There is a story that I learned in Goa, and I'm not sure if it applies to the whole subcontinent or not, that routes of international travel, roadways across the subcontinent, between all the various different tribes, many of whom didn't share the same beliefs or iconography at all. Supposedly, coconuts were found in South India, and the chillum was found mostly in North India at first. And some genius, we have no name, invented putting a chillum, knocking the hole out of a coconut and putting in another hole for a vent, and putting the chillum in the coconut, and voila, you have a hookah, you have a water pipe. And from that developed the real hookahs, which were long and tall in India as well as in the Middle East.
Kind of like what this guy's using.
Yes, this is very definitely one of the early water pipes with a chillum tucked in there. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose you would suck out of this one.
Yeah.
Because the coal is in this one.
That's right.
And so that developed into putting this whole apparatus on a stand, usually a very ornate metal, gold sometimes, silver usually. So you have a stand for your chillum so you don't have to mess with it. You don't have to put it down or you don't have to hold it. And the chillum gets so hot that everyone, to this day in India, wraps a handkerchief or a piece of cloth around it. So you see people, even on the street corners sometimes, ordinary, normal people, and then you have these sadhus everywhere in India, especially around Benares and especially in North India, whose whole life is devoted to smoking the chillum and putting themselves in a mental state which is worshipful. I had an experience in India. I went up to a sadhu to offer him some alms, which is very conventional. Giving to beggars is not associated with a bad thing in India. It's associated with helping keep their religion alive. which the sadhus do. At a certain point, when a man reaches a certain age in India, they shed all their clothing. They very often leave their wives and go wandering on the streets, the wandering sadhus. And from that point on, they are entirely reliant on ordinary people to support them. And they do all over India. Plus, when you go to a festival like the Kumbh Mela, you find thousands of sadhus all coming together, walking all over India, coming together at the various festival points. There are 4 of them. And it must be stunning. I never went to a Kumbh Mela. It wasn't the year that I was there. But it must be stunning. Thousands and thousands of people worshiping Bang. And worshiping with Bang, worshiping Shiva with Bang. I walked up to a sadhu to find out where he got his necklace. These are small beads made out of the kernel of some nut. I'm not sure which one it is, but all sadhus wear them. So I wanted to get a necklace that I could take home with me. I came up to the sadhu and I was being very reverential, and he immediately bent down and touched my feet. And I was fresh to India at the time, and I didn't know that that was a sign of huge respect. So I backed up, and the sadhu followed me, touching my feet. And somebody said, "That's okay, that's worship. That's a form of respect." And I indicated to him that I liked his necklace. We couldn't speak together, but I indicated, he took his necklace off his head and put it around mine and went like that.
Wow.
And I went like that right back to him. I still have that necklace.
Wow, wonderful. That's a wonderful story. They're supposed to have a lot of power when you receive such a necklace like that.
Exactly.
And perhaps you recognized your future work in the liberation of cannabis somehow.
Yeah, that would be good, predicting the future. The other part of that is that the necklace partly represents the Brahmin thread, the sacred thread that all Brahmins wear in India. It was supposedly a hemp thread originally.
Yeah.
I don't know what they're made out of now, possibly.
No, it was originally a hemp thread according to the Vedas. That's what they prescribed for sure.
Exactly. So every sadhu is not only smoking marijuana, but is carrying symbolically the origins of marijuana with him as he travels.
Wow, fascinating. You know, you probably will recognize these little figures here as well.
Scythians.
Scythians. Now, you may know some history about that in cannabis, I'm sure.
Well, here we are back with Herodotus, who is the first one of the Greeks to tell the story of the Scythians. He tells the story that they would erect a small tent based on Herodotus says 3 stakes, but the ones that they dug up in Pazyryk are 6 stakes. So it was about 3 or 4 feet tall. It would be covered with a piece of felt or possibly hemp cloth, and there would be a little opening in the cloth. Inside this tent they would put a cauldron. In the cauldron they would put red hot stones, and on top of the stones, or sometimes I've read on that the hemp was thrown in first, and then the red hot stones added. And out came, according to Herodotus, such a vapor that it far exceeded any Greek vapor bath, and they would howl for joy. It's a wonderful passage. What it means is that Herodotus is presenting something the Greeks did not believe in. For him to say that the Scythian vapor bath was superior to Greek vapor baths was a big no-no. The barbarian practices are never superior to Greek practices. And the wonderful thing about Herodotus is that he told that story with a straight face, even though he himself may not have believed it. Think about Herodotus and the other historians of ancient Greece coming together and discovering the Scythians, discovering the Proto-Iranians, and talking about the history of marijuana with them. There's even a point at which Herodotus was simply not believed by his peers, by his contemporaries. They thought he was making stories up. And the genius of Herodotus is very simply that he was an ethnographer. He wrote the story down even if he didn't believe it.
Right.
That is beautiful. That's the heart of ethnography. I wrote a paper about the history of ethnography as well. And what it did was everybody in ancient Greece read Herodotus. He was their primary historian, and not only did the Greeks read him, but many of the surrounding areas, right up to present-day United States, rely on Herodotus as
a historical source. Well,
so these Scythians, which the Greeks called skutoi, and are also known in the Far East as Saka, conquered an enormous space, but they were nomadic, so they didn't establish administrative centers, like was done with the Incas in South America, for instance. But they were travelers, and everywhere they went, they influenced the use of bong, and spread the use of bong. And when it came into Greece, it had to fight with wine, which had been accepted through Dionysus, and was never very much accepted in ancient Greece, with one exception. There was something called potamurgus, which people don't know what was involved with the recipe for that, but may very well have involved bong, and it was used as a sacred libation in many, many practices. And that probably came from them, although it had been by that time converted from smoking to the drink that is so popular.
Well, they found, besides the bronze cauldron, they found Scythian vessels that were contained cannabis, and there's evidence of cannabis-infused wine amongst the Scythians as well. And also, when they started preparing these beverages, they took the cauldron shape that had been used for the burning of stones
and used that as the shape for the beverage.
In order to describe a link. I've got something really special here that you're going to find fascinating that brings the Scythians and Indians together. You probably know in the up until from about 4th century BC to about 200 AD in northern India, it was known as the Scythian period.
Yes.
And this ancient coin from about 200 AD actually depicts a Scythian king, but he's got dreadlocks like Shiva, and he's got the serpent around his neck, and he's holding the trident there, and then Shiva's jug jars in his hand, and then on the back side there's Shiva with his bull Nandi behind him.
Indeed, that's beautiful. Is this modern?
This is from 200 AD.
200 AD,
so it's like
very modern, very modern.
Yeah, so it's an 1800-year-old coin showing the connection between these two fascinating ancient world cannabis cultures. East meets West over cannabis.
And also the use of a necklace. The use of necklaces is not popular in Christianity or in most of the ancient religions. But in Shiva worship, it's absolutely essential because you're wearing essential icons of the god. Also, Shiva is wearing, usually carries a drum, and that relates all the way across the subcontinent with the origin of music. The idea being, get stoned and let's play drums and play flutes and play sitars and so forth. And that sort of festival is very common. It's like a rock concert in India today. Thousands of people will gather all night and listen to sitar playing and just pretty much get stoned. The other thing is weddings. All Indian weddings by ancient custom are filled with bong, and not necessarily ceremonially. In other words, people get slightly stoned at weddings, even though they're conventional people. And contrast that with the sacraments of bread and wine, which are very often used in Christian weddings. And once again, you have the clash between alcohol cultures and marijuana cultures.
Have you ever heard of the Festival of Colors, where they throw the paint on them?
Holi.
That's another cannabis holiday, isn't it?
Holi is so wonderful. Everyone in India wears kind of old clothes because they know what's happening. And everyone goes around throwing colored water and prasad, which is a little grainy, sugary thing, on each other. And everybody ends up looking like the rainbow colors of a hippie costume. Everybody looks like tie-dye.
And drinking bong the whole time.
Oh, and drinking bong the whole time, exactly, yes. It's a wonderful festival.
Holi is the festival of colors and the festival which doesn't recognize any restrictions. Bhang has become synonymous with the Holi festival. Bhang is used in a variety of lip-sacking dishes like thandai, sharbat, bhang ki goli, and laddu, as they all provide an extra bit of joy to its consumers. Varanasi, the land of Lord Shiva, is the hub of bhang and is distributed in full swing during the festivities of Holi. So this festival enjoyed the spring of colors with a dose of bhang.
When cannabis reached the medieval Muslim cultures, spread across the Middle East and also down into Africa, there was a great debate, a legalistic debate. The Quran had prohibited alcohol. The Quran is very explicit that Muslims are not supposed to drink alcohol, although many in the modern age do. But when hashish came into Muslim society, there was a great debate about, because it was not explicitly mentioned in the Quran, so there was this enormous theological debate about whether cannabis could be accepted as wine was forbidden.
As we have bars in every town and village and city in this country, they have hash dens. Muhammad said that drinking alcohol is a sin punishable by death. In the Quran, the description is the crowd is supposed to tear you into pieces and throw you into the trees for the birds to eat. That's the punishment for having a beer. But he didn't mention hash. And if you look at human nature, and you look at man everywhere, he needs a release. So if alcohol was precluded from being that release, hash became that release.
And there's a beautiful poem in Franz Rosenthal's book called The Herb, Hashish versus Medieval Muslim Society. Beautiful poem. First he talks about kind of an orgiastic dance ritual that was being done by the Muslims. And people started shouting, "Bravo hashish!" And they all moved in procession to the Al-Fadil bath with Al-Jaishi naked, dancing with lascivious gestures and singing, "By God, bravo hashish! It stirs deep meanings. Don't pay attention to those who blame it. Refrain from the daughter of the vine, and do not be stingy with it. Eat it dry and live. By God, bravo hashish! It is above pure wine when noblemen use it. Eat it and grow, young man. Eating it revives the dead. By God, bravo hashish! It gives the stupid, inexperienced, dull person the cleverness of the straightforward sage. I don't think I can escape from it. By God, bravo hashish!" In other words, some of the people very quickly adopted hashish rituals and dances and so forth, as had spread all across India and the Middle East for centuries, and then down into Africa. The famous story of the discovery of hashish is the legend of Sheikh Haydar. I'm not sure about the date for that, possibly 9th century AD. This old, very dour, very serious monk walked out into the desert one day out of his monastery and discovered a plant. He found a plant, and although there was no breeze at all and the desert was deathly still and beastly hot, he found this plant was swaying gently in the breeze. Swaying gently in the breeze. I can just see the marijuana plant standing there swaying in the breeze. And he said, "What is this?" He had never seen this plant before. And so he took some of its leaves and ate them and came back to the monastery with a smile on his face which his fellow monks had never seen before. And he said, "This plant is happy. This plant is joyful. This plant gives peace." And that supposedly is the discovery of eating cannabis in Arabia. Well, that's historically that's really foolish, because cannabis had been known in the Middle East for many millennia, I'm sure. And so what is that story about? What would a curious monk do? He's wandering in the desert. He sees this strange plant waving in the breeze, in no breeze. Would not he reach out and touch that plant, not just to eat it, but maybe to rub it a little bit and press it between his fingers like that? And oh, that puts a gum on his hands, it puts a resin on his hand. And the more you do it, you come up with a little ball that is mixed with your own human skin oil. And if you eat that ball, that's going to be a lot better than just eating the raw leaves of cannabis. So I attribute the discovery of hashish itself, how to make hashish, to the story of Sheikh Haydar. Then in the 11th or 12th century AD, in I believe it was northern Syria, there was a gentleman named Hassan Isaba who'd become very famous because William Burroughs loved this story. Hassan Isaba was said to have established a sect which was called the Assassins, and which many modern etymologists think means the name assassins derived from the Hashishin, or Hashisha, the people who ate the hashish. And the story, according to Marco Polo, is that this Hassan Isaba would gather novices that he wanted to include in his sect, and he would give them a potion of cannabis and retire them into a beautiful garden filled with naked ladies, and they would become very stoned, and this was to give them a taste of paradise. So if they joined his group of assassins, they would, and if they were killed while doing their missions, they would then be able to join paradise in the manner to which Hassan had introduced them through the use of cannabis. The question, of course, is what was in the potion. Nobody knows. Marco Polo implies that it might have been hashish, but Marco Polo himself didn't know very much about hashish. He'd just come from China anyway, bringing spaghetti across. So the question is, what was in the potion? I am thinking that there may have been an Arabian tradition growing out of the use of hashish, in which they made a potion out of hash or bhang, somewhat similar perhaps to soma that was made out of ephedra and cannabis and poppies. There was the use of cannabis itself may not have been the only ingredient of this potion. There may have been other admixtures, including possibly the poppy, which would anesthetize and knock somebody out enough so that they would believe that they really were in heaven. Now, I've been stoned enough on hash myself to know that that's a very good possibility of what happens when you take an enormous dose. At first, you get very sleepy and you may get hallucinations. But if you're surrounded literally by physical naked ladies and beautiful gardens with water flowing through them and the sounds of beautiful music, that sounds like a description of paradise to me. The irony is that the assassins became most famous because they invented the idea of moles, what we now in the CIA would call a mole. You, at a very young age, you take a boy, and usually a boy, and put them in the court of some king that you didn't like, or some other neighboring tribesman, and that boy would grow up and be fully accepted and become part of the palace guard, and then kill the guy 20 years later after you'd given him the assignment. That's what the assassins are famous for. And so the way that that got twisted around throughout history was very interesting. First of all, when the French poets of the early 19th century discovered hashish, they formed a society they called the Club des Hashishins, supposedly imitating the assassins. But this was a very French literary society, not an assassin society. And some of the best literary writers of all France in the early 19th century, including Baudelaire and Gautier and a strange doctor named Jean Moreau, used to get together and have these soirees, and they would all get very stoned drinking dawamesk, which is, or eating dawamesk, which is a sort of a pastry that is very liquid. made in Morocco and Algeria and mixed with nuts and fruits of various kinds. So it's sort of like a little fruit cake. But if you eat a bite or two of that, it's going to get you very stoned like a modern cannabis edible would. So they would go into this beautiful hotel called the Hotel Pimodan, and they would rent a whole series of beautifully decorated rooms, and they'd all get stoned out of their minds. There's a famous drawing of the doctor, Moreau, playing the piano at one of these soirees, dressed in Turkish dress. So they were having a good old time, imitating what they thought was the true Arab tradition, which is not killing people, but enjoying life and being a poet on terms of hashish. Then it went further. By the time that legend got to the United States, the French philologist Sylvestre de Sacy had decided by that time that the word assassin came from hashishin. And so when the legend came into the United States, mostly in the 20th century actually, Harry Anslinger adopted it. And suddenly it reverted to being the idea that you're going to take marijuana and go out and kill somebody. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what the original legend said. The original legend said that hashish would give you a taste of paradise, and then you would go out and kill somebody, and if you got killed too, then you would join paradise. So Harry Anslinger turned it right around and called it the assassin of youth, and used that as one of his main themes about why hashish should be outlawed. Very interesting twist on the assassin's legend.
Harry J. Anslinger, Commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
The Treasury Department intends to pursue a relentless warfare against the despicable, dope-peddling vulture who preys on the weakness of his fellow man.
A Russian archaeologist named Victor Saryanidi, the author of Margiana and Proto-Zoroastrianism, did some very interesting archaeological work in Turkmenistan. He started in the late 1970s, but Russia invaded Afghanistan in '79, and that cut off his work completely. And then there were a great many translation difficulties before it got into English in the 1990s. What Saryanidi did was he was investigating the myths of Soma and the temples of Margiana, which was the Greek name for northern Iran. And Margiana and Bactria were linked archaeologically by all kinds of finds, Bactria being further east and just north of Afghanistan, in the northern part of Afghanistan. So throughout this Bactria-Margiana complex, Saryanidi did some excavations and discovered one of the oldest fortresses in the Middle East of the time. He discovered several different fortified walled temples in Margiana and Bactria. And when he started excavating these temples, it turned out to be exactly the description that Euripides had given of Bactria in the 5th century BC. And that was, they were walled cities which contained gods. What Saryanidi discovered was that there were several rooms in these temple complexes which were set apart from the main worshipping areas. And these were apparently manufacturing areas where the drugs that they were taking were manufactured. The drug was called Soma, or Halma, in Iran. He dug into these archaeological temples, and he discovered that several of the rooms contained huge vats which were sealed to the floor so they couldn't be moved, and they were lined with gypsum, which would be a sealer for the inside of the vats. And he was able to get scraped samples off the bottom of these urns and submit them for analysis, and they discovered that the pollen grains which had been preserved consisted of ephedra and cannabis, and in some cases poppies. Poppies pollen was found in little pipes that they think were actually used for poppy. Perhaps even opium, but uncertain.
Deep in the Karakum Desert in Central Asia, a previously unknown Bronze Age civilization has been discovered. It was believed that there had never been human occupation in this desert until the archaeologist Victor Sarianidis started working here in Turkmenistan 40 years ago. Here in Gunur Tepe, ancient ritual practices have been identified, such as preparation of hallucinogenic ritual drinks.
В этих сосудах клали эти растения, федру и каннабис. Это алкогольный напиток, но который не все пили, а только жрецы.
So what he discovered was that soma was probably made out of ephedra and cannabis and poppy in some mixture. And the reason I mention that is partly because I think that may have been what the assassins were using, but also because it introduces the idea of ephedra. Now, ephedra has been worshipped in many societies. He also discovered that ephedra is the source of ephedrine, which in modern days is used to make speed, methadone, and which has therefore been banned in many countries, including Canada and the United States. And ephedra itself would be a minor stimulant that would keep people awake and worshipful and would excite the people as well as transcending to a higher consciousness. So Sarianidi concludes that the soma of the India and the haoma of ancient Iran was probably a mixture of ephedra, cannabis, and poppy that was even possibly fermented, although there's a great deal of argument about that, and then was handed out in the public rooms of these temple sanctuaries and drunk by the people in the form of a libation. And then they would have all-night singing and dancing festivals, just as they still do with the Kumbh Mela for Soma in India. It's a very interesting progression then across the Middle East from Soma originally to possibly the legend of the assassins and the idea of using potions that were made out of cannabis in order to induce transcendental states, higher states of consciousness. Going back to ancient China, where the Emperor Shennong is said to have discovered ephedra and cannabis and ginseng among hundreds of herbs that were used medically. Shennong was worshipped as the god of agriculture. He's often called the farmer god. And he's also the divinity who introduced medicine. He is said to have had a transparent abdomen so that he could see the actions of drugs that he took orally. He could watch their effects as they went through his system. That's a marvelous metaphor for understanding the effects of drugs on the human body. A beautiful idea of a transparent abdomen. So he supposedly had tested 100 different types of herbs and found many of them useful for medicine. So cannabis has been used in Chinese medicine from the very earliest days. Not only that, but the hemp seeds and hemp in general, all the industrial uses of hemp were known to ancient China. They used it as a grain food. It was one of their staple grains, probably even before rice. And it was ubiquitous across China. There are references in poetry to how beautiful cannabis was, and so forth. The other part of that is that's the founding of Chinese medicine based on cannabis, the same way that Ayurvedic medicine in India was based on Lord Shiva bringing cannabis. So here in China and India as well, we have the idea of using medicinal potions, not just to get high with, and also at the same time in China rather than India, the same plant was used for all the industrial uses of making fiber and being eaten as a grain and being made into food products and also being used as a magical wand. Hemp sticks were supposedly beaten on the beds of sick patients in order to inspire the magic of the plant itself to help them recover and get better. Very interesting. The final thing I want to say about China involves this doctor, a famous early physician named Watteau. He is famous because he took the ideas of Shen Nung in the oldest pharmacopoeia of China, which is the Shen Nung pharmacopoeia. Took many of those ideas and invented modern, for the 2nd century AD, modern medicines based on those ideas. The one that he is most famous for is called Mafe-san. It was taking of cannabis and making a potion out of it by boiling. And then adding wine to that and drinking this hemp boiling compound in the form of a wine. And it would anesthetize, it would knock the patient out so that literally he could do stomach surgery. He could carve into the human body doing surgery while the patient is completely anesthetized and didn't feel a thing. And the patient would awaken and consider that to be an act of magic. I mean, that was genuine magic in the days when nobody knew how to do surgery with an anesthetic. That use, I call it an infused wine. And the use of cannabis-infused wines also spread out of China, spread all the way across the Middle East. It may have been an infused wine for soma in later eras, although I'm not at all certain of that. But the idea of using other herbs in wine became very important in ancient Greece because their wine tasted very terrible. If you've drunk Retsina, you understand that it's kind of a sour, bitter taste to the wine. So they usually added other herbs and chemicals and potions to the wine that they were drinking. And there is a strong suspicion in my own mind that cannabis was probably one of the ingredients of infused wines used by the Greeks. The history of cannabis in Africa originated very early in the Arab expeditions down the east coast of Africa and also down into Central Africa. It seems to have been spread by Arab traders, early, probably 7th or 8th, 9th centuries AD. Hemp does not seem to have been used for cloth or thread very much in Africa. Instead, it was almost universally used as a drink or a smoke for ritual purposes. Chris showed me this wonderful Dutch drawing of an African woman smoking marijuana in a pipe that looks sort of like a big chillum, and one of her breasts is thrown over her back to feed her baby while she's multitasking and getting a little stoned, which incidentally brings to mind that bong is very useful in childbirth and in raising children. I was once told by a beautiful Israeli researcher, Esther Frieda, that they have found that people who are lacking in cannabis receptors, they did this first on mice and then I believe on people, who were lacking cannabis receptors could not digest milk. They could suckle, but they couldn't get the milk into their system in a useful way. That's a very interesting comment. There was recently an archaeological find in Palestine dated to about the 4th century AD of a mummified body of a young girl, apparently during childbirth. They had used cannabis in order to relax her and also to enlarge her birth canal. There were found at the same site some glass jars containing cannabis, so we know for sure that that's what it was. The reason I mention that is that the use of cannabis as an aid to childbirth is quite universal in India and across the Middle East, and then down into Africa, where the Soto tribe was very famous for using cannabis, not only smoke but also drinks, to assist childbirth. The way that marijuana got into Africa was probably 8th or 9th centuries AD, mostly through Arab traders down the east coast of Africa. And they introduced it from there all across Central Africa, where there was a Baluba tribe led by a leader named Kalamba Mukenge, I believe was his name. And this tribe had conquered a whole bunch of neighboring tribes, and all of which had conflicting religions and practices. And in order to unite these tribes that he'd recently conquered, Kalamba Mukenge said that the only religion we will have from now on is the hemp religion, and everyone is required to take hemp and become part of this religion. And what it did, according to historians, is unified those tribes, and so that they became one of the most powerful nations in early Africa, the Balubas. And the one thing that strikes me as interesting about that was that not only was it used ceremonially and religiously to unite the tribes in the worship of one thing instead of many, it was also used as a punishment. The recording of Victor Robinson, who investigated this mythology, was that if you committed a crime or a bad deed, you were forced to sit and drink and smoke so much out of a central cauldron that you would pass out. I think that's an interesting punishment for having done something wrong, is that you had to smoke yourself unconscious. It seems to me to be a much better way of chastising someone than to put them in jail. I like that old story.